Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified. Today we have taken the important articles from The Hindu and curated as per the demands of Civil Services examination. The topics for today's discussion are mentioned over your screen. So let's begin our session. The first topic of today's discussion is based on this article which appeared on the page number 8 of The Hindu. This article is about the dispute over sharing the river water of Kaveri between the states Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. The context of this article is that Tamil Nadu government has sought the intervention of Supreme Court over its due share of Kaveri water from Karnataka, as Karnataka has refused to share the river water with Tamil Nadu. So this topic of interstate river water dispute is important for our GS paper 2 Polity and Governance. It is important for the syllabus head Issues and Challenges pertaining to the federal structure. Also, Kaveri River is an important water resource which is important for our GS paper 1 World Geography under the subhead Distribution of Key Natural Resources across the world. Now, proceeding with this article, we will be discussing what is the brief background of this river water dispute, some key facts about the Kaveri River, and then we will discuss the broader topic of interstate water disputes. Under this topic, we will discuss the Interstate Water Disputes Act 1956, and then we will discuss what are the structural and procedural issues in such tribunals. We will also see the impacts of interstate river water disputes on the management of water resources. So in this regard, UPSC had asked a question in previous year 2013, which was regarding the failure of constitutional mechanism to resolve the interstate water disputes. So by the end of this discussion, you will have more clarity over interstate water disputes and you will be able to solve this question and learn some other concepts. Now, starting with interstate water disputes. The Constitutional Assembly, when it was framing the Constitution, had already anticipated that water disputes will occur in future. So in this context, an article was added in the Indian Constitution, which is Article 262. The article is regarding the adjudication of disputes relating to waters of interstate rivers and river valleys. So this Article 262 grants powers to the Parliament that Parliament may by any law provide for the adjudication of any dispute or complaint with respect to the use, distribution or control of the waters of any interstate river water or river valley. This means that Parliament can enact any law for the adjudication of any interstate river water dispute. And this article also states that in this matter, neither the Supreme Court nor any other court shall exercise jurisdiction in respect to any such dispute or complaint as referred in clause 1. Hence, the Parliament of India has enacted the following acts to manage and resolve interstate water disputes in India. The first act is River Boards Act 1956. So this River Board Act of 1956 empowers the central government to establish river boards. So the objective of this act is to facilitate coordination and cooperation among the riparian states for the efficient utilization, conservation and management of water resources or for the development of river basins. So largely, the intention is to prevent any conflicts regarding water sharing between the riparian states. And another such law enacted by the Parliament is Interstate Water Dispute Acts of 1956. The earlier law aimed to prevent any conflicts between the riparian states. However, in case any conflicts arise in the distribution or sharing of water resources between the riparian state, then in that case, Interstate Water Dispute Act is the primary legislation for the adjudication and resolution of disputes related to interstate rivers and water resources. So, under this act, if any state feels that its rights are being infringed by any other state, then that particular state can request the central government to set up a tribunal to resolve the dispute. So, such a tribunal is constituted for dispute resolution, and the tribunals can award the verdicts which are binding in nature. Now, let us see a brief background on the Kaveri river water dispute. Kaveri is an interstate river which origins in the state of Karnataka. Kaveri rises in the Talakaveri in Brahmagiri range in western Ghats of Karnataka. After its origin from Karnataka, the river flows southeast and enters Tamil Nadu before draining into Bay of Bengal. The river basin of this state includes Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and the Union Territory of Puducherry. The important left bank tributaries of the river include Hemavati, Shimsha, Arkavati. And the important right bank tributaries of the river include Harangi, Kabini, Suvarnavati, Bhavani, Amravati, and Noil. So in this map we can see the location of Mattur Dam. It is a dam which is made on Kaveri river and one of the largest dams of India and also the largest dams of Tamil Nadu. So as we saw that Kaveri is an interstate river. The river is long disputed between these two states, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. The history of this dispute can be traced as back as the dispute between Madras Presidency and Mysore state, and following which there was some negotiations between the water sharing of this river among these states. And even after independence, the issues persisted. And because of which, in the year 1990, the central government constituted a Kaveri Water Disputes Tribunal to mediate the escalating tensions between the two states. So this Kaveri Water Disputes Tribunal gave an award in the year 2007, which specified specific allocations of waters to Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Kerala, and Puducherry. So these numbers are the water allocations by the Kaveri Water Disputes Tribunal in 1000 million cubic feet. So these numbers are not important, this is just for your general reference. But after the distribution of this award by this tribunal, the states were not satisfied and there were litigations by these concerned states in the Supreme Court. And finally, in the year 2018, Supreme Court modified this award. And as per Supreme Court, the share of Tamil Nadu was reduced and the share of Karnataka was increased. Now, despite all these efforts, the Kaveri water sharing dispute exists. And it has remained a persistent challenge, which are marked by protest, legal battles, and periodic tension between these two states. And presently, the news article says that why is the Kaveri water sharing issue flaring up again? And the primary reason for the dispute this year is lower rainfall in the Kaveri catchment this year in the present southwest monsoon. And because of this lower rainfall in the Kaveri catchment area, Karnataka has refused to share the water with Tamil Nadu. And whereas Tamil Nadu is demanding following of a distress sharing formula. So what is a distress sharing formula? It is a mechanism which is established to determine the allocation of water from a river during the times of water scarcity, like lower rainfall or during drought-like conditions. Though the Kaveri Water River Disputes Tribunal has formulated a distress sharing formula for this river, but the implementation of this formula remains a challenge. Now let us understand the broader topic, which is what are the structural and procedural issues in these water disputes tribunal, which is hampering their effective implementation. The first such issue is protracted litigations and delay. This is, there is a long delay or tribunals take a long time in delivering its final verdict. And this chronic delay is due to the adversarial litigations or numerous litigations filed by the states. Another issue is delay in tribunal formation. Oftentimes, the process of constituting tribunals is slow and cumbersome, and this leads to considerable delay in addressing the dispute. And this delays in tribunal formation can further deteriorate the situation. Another such issue is legal anomalies. So presently, the arrangement is like when the tribunals have given their final verdict, the tribunals are dissolved. And this arrangement deprives the state to redress their grievances when the tribunals are dissolved. And as we saw that under the Article 262, the Supreme Court have limited power over these awards of tribunals. At most, the Supreme Court can ask these states to speeden the execution of these awards. So hence in this case, Supreme Court has limited role or limited power in providing clarifications of the awards of tribunals. And because of which the states are left with no resort, which adds to their discontentment and leads in inefficient implementation of the awards by these tribunals. Further, for the awards given by the tribunals, there is a limited enforcement mechanism, or there is an institutional vacuum in the implementation of the awards by the tribunals. And because of this limited enforcement mechanism, often after the awards are given, these awards are not implemented by these states. Another issue is political interference or public perception. So, in a multi-party democratic setting like India, such disputes have become a site of political mobilization. And these disputes are the opportunities for the political parties to garner votes or to arouse public sentiments. And hence, this political interference also sabotages the implementation of the awards by the tribunals. And apart from all these issues, there is another issue of technical complexity. Often, at the heart of these disputes are technical complexities like assessment of the hydrology of the river basin, overseeing the impact of the awards on irrigation and their environmental impacts. And since there is a lack of expertise of these matters among the members of the tribunals, so sometimes there can be inaccurate assessment in awarding specific water allocation. And finally, there is a lack of acceptable distress sharing formula. So often during the times of distress, like in a monsoon deficit season, the disputes between the states escalate. And this is because of lack of acceptable or successful distress water sharing formula. Now, having seen these issues in the tribunals, now let us see what are the impacts of interstate water disputes on the management of water resources, or what are the consequences of such river water disputes. The first consequence will be improper utilization of water resources. So oftentimes it is seen that the upper riparian states, they take away the major chunk or the major share of water. This can either be done by overutilization of this water for irrigation practices or by diversion of this water by the form of dams or reservoirs. So this improper utilization of water by the upper riparian state leaves the lower riparian states with a lower share of water, and thus causes water scarcity in the lower riparian states. For example, because of this dispute over the Kaveri river water sharing, the farmers in Tamil Nadu have complained of scarcity of water for irrigation. Other issue is it will hamper the development and management of watershed. Now, this overexploitation of water by any state leads to disruption of the natural flow of water in the lower riparian states. So in order to restore this ecological balance of the watershed, there should be efforts for the management of watershed among the basin states. But because of these interstate water disputes, the policies of these states are not in coherence, impacts the management or sustainable development of the watershed. Another issue is that this lack of coordination or this dispute between the state can also stall the infrastructure projects. Now, because of this dispute, the vital infrastructure projects like irrigation canals, reservoirs, or river interlinking projects are stalled because of multiple litigations in the Supreme Court or in the tribunals. And one such example in this regard is the delay in the implementation of Satluj Yamuna link project, and this can hinder the agricultural prosperity. Another issue is unabated pollution and poor ecological health of rivers and surrounding ecosystems. So, because of this lack of coordination between the state, there is an extreme degradation of the rivers and their surrounding ecosystems. One such example can be seen in the case of river Yamuna. This river is subject to multiple disputes, and this is also one of the reasons why it causes the dilution of efforts from these states in restoring the ecological health of the river. So finally, there is a risk of induced disasters. When there is a river dispute between the states, the lack of coordination between these states can lead to uncoordinated release of water from the upper riparian state to the lower riparian states. And these instances of unregulated water release when there is a surplus monsoon can result to downstream flooding, loss of lives and property. And one such example is the disastrous floods in Kerala due to the mismanagement of Mullaperiyar Dam. Hence, these interstate river water disputes are against the spirit of cooperative federalism. So often these kind of river disputes engage states with varying political, economic and resource power. And such power asymmetry can give an upper hand to the stronger states, and thereby they can undermine the equitable resolution. So what is a way forward in this regard? The first and foremost thing is political dialogue and consensus building. The only effective solution for resolution of such kind of disputes and for the implementation of the awards by the tribunals is sustained political dialogues between the concerned parties or the concerned states. And this is important for preserving the watershed, for sustainable water allocation, and for the social well-being of the population. And for this intergovernmental mediation, there is a provision in Constitution, which is Article 263. Article 263 of Indian Constitution provides for interstate council. So this interstate council can be utilized as a space for mediating these disputes before taking these disputes to the legal solutions in tribunals. Further, there should be an integrated approach, a participatory framework and scientific planning for the river basin management that takes into account the ecological factors, the technicalities which we discussed earlier, and on scientific lines, this framework should have a distress resolution formula that should be acceptable to all the concerned parties. And apart from these measures, the focus should be on long-term solutions to preserve the ecological health of the river and the watershed development. The examples can be by recharging the river water through afforestation, by river interlinking, by adopting smart agricultural practices like micro irrigation or water harvesting. So finally we can conclude that for an effective long-term solution, there is a need for political solutions which should be supplemented by legal and institutional mechanism. The next topic for today's discussion is based on this article which appeared on the page number 6 of The Hindu. The article says that consumption-based poverty estimates have relevance. So presently India is using consumption-based poverty estimates and also a multi-dimensional poverty index to estimate the level of poverty in India and to address it. So what is a consumption-based poverty estimate? Consumption-based poverty estimate refers to a method that measures poverty based on an individual's or his household's consumption patterns. That is, this estimate assesses the value of goods and services which are consumed by individuals or their household as a way to determine their living standards and their economic welfare. But India has been also using the multi-dimensional poverty index, and a recent report by Niti Aayog on the multi-dimensional poverty shows that the percentage of poor in India has gone down from 25% from the year 2015-2016 to 15% in the year 2019 and 21. Also, the recently released Global Multidimensional Poverty Report 2023 of the UNDP, which is United Nations Development Programme, show that the incidence of multidimensional poverty index has declined from 27.5% in 2015-2016 to 16.2% in 29-21. So based on this article, we will develop the understanding of some important parameters to estimate poverty and the essence of this report. So this topic is important for our GS paper 3 economy under the subhead inclusive growth and the issues arising from it. So in simple terms, poverty means a social condition which is characterized by lack of resources to meet the minimum level of living standards. So this is a generalistic definition of poverty. And now poverty can be classified into two types. Now what is absolute poverty? It refers to the inability of a person or any household to provide even the basic necessities of life. So this means that the person or any household is even unable to afford the basic necessities such as food, clothing and shelter. The other kind of poverty is relative poverty. It is the condition in which the people lack the minimum amount of income needed to maintain the average standard of living in the society in which they live. This means that though these people may have enough to afford the basic necessities of life, but they may lack means to fully participate and enjoy in the society in which they live. A basic difference between these two kinds of poverty is that while absolute poverty is related to mere survival, but relative poverty can lead to the feelings of exclusion, inequality, lack of access to opportunities like that of education, healthcare. Hence, the definition of absolute poverty is universal, but the definition of relative poverty is society specific and it depends on their standards of living. The next dimension is how to measure poverty. Now, poverty is estimated through poverty line. What is a poverty line? Poverty line is the reference point for assessing the extent of poverty in any country. In other words, it is a threshold level or the minimum income required to meet basic needs. So in Indian context, there have been various committees constituted to define a poverty line. The first such committee is YK Alagh Committee. It was constituted in the year 1979. So what was the definition of poverty line as per this committee? The committee defined poverty line as the per capita consumption expenditure level to meet average per capita daily calorie requirement in urban and rural areas. So as per this poverty line, the individual or household who could not meet the calorie requirement of 2400 kilocalories for rural areas or 2100 kilocalories for urban areas were classified as below the poverty line. So as per this committee, there were different poverty line baskets for rural and urban consumption. So this poverty line was based on consumption expenditure on per capita daily calorie requirement. After it, in the year 1993, the Lakdawala expert group retained the poverty line recommended by the Alagh Committee at the national level based on minimum nutritional requirement, as we saw earlier. However, the difference was that this expert group disaggregated the national poverty line into state-specific poverty lines. And these state-specific poverty lines reflected the interstate price differentials. So let us understand this based on an example. Say there are two states, one is a Himalayan state, say Himachal Pradesh, and consider one southern Indian state, say Tamil Nadu. Now, the poverty lines of these two states may be different as per this expert group. And this state-specific poverty lines of these two states will reflect the interstate price differential. This means the expenditure done by an individual of this state on food would be different from the expenditure done by an individual of Tamil Nadu. This is because of a different price of food grains in Himachal Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. And this is also because different food preferences or dietary preferences of the people of Himachal Pradesh and of the people of Tamil Nadu. So, based on this interstate price differential, based on the consumption pattern, the poverty lines of different states were divided into state-specific poverty lines. But still, the estimation of poverty lines was based on consumption expenditure, based on minimum nutritional requirement. Now, if you notice, in the estimation of poverty line by the YK Alagh Committee and Lakdawala expert group, an individual's expenditure on education and health were not incorporated in calculating a poverty line, as it was only based on calorie requirement. So, the expenditure on health and education were not incorporated in determining the poverty line. Also, it was assumed that the primary responsibility for providing health services or education services is with the government. But after the 1991 LPG reforms, the social sector expenditure of the government reduced drastically, and the private expenditure in these services like health and education was increased. Hence, the Tendulkar Committee of 2009 recommended the incorporation of private expenditure on health and education while estimating poverty. And another important recommendation of this committee was to shift away the present calculation of poverty lines based on calorie intake norms to the targeted outcomes. So this was an important concept. This means that earlier the poverty lines was based on intake norms, but now the committee recommended to shift away these poverty line estimation to the targeted outcomes. The outcome-based approach means estimating the outcomes. For example, health outcomes. For estimating health outcome, we can analyze the reduction in infant mortality rate or the reduction in maternal mortality rate. And for educational outcome, we can assess the improvement in the literacy rate. Hence, the keyword here is poverty line estimates based on outcomes, not on intake. Also, it suggested that instead of two separate poverty line baskets for rural and urban poverty, it recommended a uniform all India poverty line across rural and urban India. Hence, the present poverty estimates in India are calculated based on the Tendulkar Committee method. Hence, the poverty estimate in India based on the poverty line, which was largely assessed by the data of National Sample Survey, is a type of consumption-based poverty estimate. But such consumption-based poverty estimate do not give a holistic picture or an in-depth picture of existing poverty in India. So, in order to understand poverty holistically, another approach is multidimensional poverty index. So, multidimensional poverty index is a comprehensive analysis of poverty which goes beyond the consumption expenditure based approach. So, this multidimensional poverty index assesses poverty based on three broad dimensions. These dimensions are health, education, and living standards. And these three dimensions consist of various subdimensions. For example, the health consists of nutrition and child mortality. Education consists of year of schooling and school attendance. Living standards include cooking fuel, sanitation, drinking water, electricity, housing, and assets. Now, each such subdimensions have been allocated some weightage. So, based on these 10 indicators, a person is assessed as multidimensionally poor if he or she is deprived in 1/3 or more than 1/3 of these weighted indicators. And people who are deprived in 1/2 or more than these weighted indicators are classified as extremely multidimensionally poor. Now let us see what is the need for multidimensional poverty index. The first reason is that the existing consumption-based poverty lines estimate gave emphasis only on income-based deprivations, but they ignored non-income based deprivations. For example, there are two people A and B with same level of monthly income. Now the person with this amount of salary level is able to access some basic facilities like education and primary healthcare in his village. And on the other hand, the person B with the same level of monthly income cannot access these services like education and health. Maybe because there is a lack of infrastructure in his place, or maybe because he is discriminated based on caste, gender, identity, or any other parameter. Now, despite these two people may have same income based deprivations, but the person B is relatively more poor as compared to person A based on his non-income based deprivations. Hence, to understand this nature of multiple deprivations in the people with similar income, we need multidimensional poverty index. Now the next factor is incidence versus intensity. The earlier consumption based poverty line estimate can only address the question like who is poor or how many households are poor based on their threshold level of poverty line, but it fails to reveal the degree of poverty for any household or any person. This means that the intensity of poverty between two people or any group of people may differ based on their availability and access to these parameters. Hence, in order to address the intensity of poverty in any population, we need multidimensional poverty index. Another reason is to formulate evidence-based policy making. So as we saw in the earlier example, such kind of income deprivation or income poverty may not suggest a specific policy directive which is needed for such people. But if we know the levels of poverty of any person based on multidimensional poverty index, this can be used in making evidence-based policy to provide specific facilities to people. So one advantage of multidimensional poverty index is that it not only measures absolute poverty, but it also measures relative poverty. And based on this index, one can gauge or judge the levels of absolute poverty as well as the levels of relative poverty in any population. But having listed the advantages of multidimensional poverty index, one cannot assume that multidimensional poverty index can replace consumption-based poverty estimate, because multidimensional poverty index has its own set of challenges. Some challenges are that gathering of data for multidimensional index can be challenging because it requires data based on multiple dimensions and based on the relative poverty level of the diverse population of India. It would be difficult to quote that which dimension or how many dimensions are relevant and should be considered in any particular index to estimate the multidimensional poverty of that society. Another reason is that the weightage which is given to each indicator may be arbitrary. So, this is the weightage which is given to these indicators, which may be arbitrary. Thus, shifting from a single dimension of poverty estimation to a multidimensional poverty estimate has its own set of challenges, and it can make the measurement of poverty more difficult. Hence, we can say that the consumption based poverty estimate are still relevant to India. But at the same time, we can say that the consumption based poverty estimates should be complemented by the multidimensional poverty index. And at this point of time in the country like India, a mixed approach using these two parameters would be an appropriate approach. The final topic for today is based on this article which appeared on the science section of e-edition of The Hindu. The context of this article is that basically the state of higher education at state universities in the field of science education is subpar. This is because majorly the curriculum of these state universities is largely outdated and the syllabus is out of sync with contemporary technologies. Further, the universities are offering undergraduation or post-graduation courses in the field of science with insufficient practical training and with inadequate and poorly maintained laboratory facilities. So basically this article is in the context of new education policy of 2020, which aims to give a greater emphasis to the STEM education. So in this article we will be seeing the challenges in the STEM education in India. This article is important for our GS paper 2 social justice. Under the syllabus head, issues relating to development and management of social sector or services related to health, education, human resources. So let us see some facts regarding the STEM education in India. Presently, India produces over 25 lakh graduates in science, technology, engineering and mathematics every year across the bachelor's and master's courses. But in the field of STEM, in the higher education, we see a greater dropout rate. This can be seen from the fact that the number of science graduates dropped to 2.9 lakh at master's level, and this number further drops at the doctoral level, with only 6,000 science PhDs awarded each year. And as already discussed, this is because of poor state of higher education at state universities and largely outdated syllabus and insufficient hands-on training. And because of these reasons, in the global ranking of 1,000 universities from 82 countries, only 23 Indian institutions are featured in this list of 1,000 universities. So definitely there is an issue of quality of education. So in the Indian universities, the expenditure on research as a proportion of GDP has gone down. This is a recent data by the Department of Science and Technology, which reflects the declining research and development expenditure as a percentage of GDP in all public and private universities in India. And if we compare the R&D expenditure of India versus other country in which India stands in the lower order, only 1% of the universities engage in active research, and hence there is decline in research outcome. This is majorly due to poor coordination between various departments and a lack of interdisciplinary approach. Also, in the number of intellectual property patents filed, in the year 2021, India filed around 62,000 patents. But if we compare India with the countries like China and US, China filed 16 lakh patents in the year 2021 and US filed 6 lakh patents in the same year. Another challenge is lesser number of women in R&D institutions, as the major pie of this representation is with men. So definitely women need to be encouraged to adapt STEM education. And in this graph we can see the number of patents filed in the office in 2021. And this is India standing at the 6th number. So in order to address these challenges, the National Education Policy of 2020 proposes to increase the overall proportion of public expenditure on education from 10% presently to 20.9% in the next 10 years. And of this additional expenditure, the major share will be assigned for strengthening quality, faculty, and operations at universities and colleges. Also, the National Education Policy in 2020 recommended the formation of National Research Foundation. And recently, the government has introduced the National Research Foundation Bill 2023. So, this National Research Foundation will be an apex body which will be aimed to provide a high-level strategic direction to scientific research in the country. For the formulation of this National Research Foundation, the total estimated cost is Rs 50,000 crores during the duration of 5 years from 2023 to 28. And this National Research Foundation will repeal the Science and Engineering Research Board (SERB), which was established in the year 2008. The Prime Minister of India will be the ex officio president of this research foundation, and the Union Minister of Science and Technology and the Union Minister of Education will be the ex officio vice presidents. The Department of Science and Technology will be the administrative department of National Research Foundation. The primary focus of this foundation will be on creating a policy framework and putting in place regulatory processes that can encourage collaboration and increase spending by the industry on research and development. For it will foster collaborations among the industry, academia, and government departments and research institutions. And this will also aim to promote interdisciplinary research and development in the country. So this brings an end to today's session. Stay connected for more updates. Thank you.